In this video, we're going to be doing a sheep brain dissection. So first we're going to talk about the four main brain divisions that we're going to be looking at as we go through this sheep brain dissection. One brain division is called the cerebrum, and I'm going to keep the colors consistent throughout this video. So anytime I'm writing in red, I'm referring to structures that are associated with the cerebrum. Another division is the cerebellum. We're also going to talk about the brainstem. And the brainstem consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The fourth division we're going to talk about is called the diencephalon. And there are three structures that make up the diencephalon. There's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland. So first let's take a look at a superior view of a sheep brain. So we're looking at the brain as if we're looking down from the top down. So the first area we're going to point out is the division known as the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is this whole area right here. You'll notice that there is a long kind of ravine that goes in between the two halves of the cerebrum. So that long ravine is called the longitudinal fissure. And each half of the cerebrum is called a cerebral hemisphere. So there is the right cerebral hemisphere, and the left cerebral hemisphere. Other features of the cerebrum include the gyri and the sulci. So the gyri are these bumps that you see here. And a singular one, is called a gyrus, and a plural, so multiple bumps, is called the gyri. Now the kind of ravines in between the bumps, a singular one is called a sulcus, and plural is sulci. Now, these structures help to increase the surface area of the brain. And by increasing surface area, that increases the number of neuron connections or synapses that can happen. So that gives us kind of higher processing power. We can see from this view, another division of the brain is the cerebellum. And cerebellum actually means little cerebrum. And as you can see, the cerebellum also has gyri and sulci, but they're smaller. One more feature to point out is this kind of deep ravine between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And this ravine is known as the transverse fissure. the cerebrum is further divided into lobes, and the names of the lobes correspond with the skull bones that overlay that part of the brain or that part of the cerebrum. So I'm just going to point out here that the front or anterior part of the brain is the frontal lobe. And of course, the frontal bone of the skull would cover that part of the brain. On the sides of the brain, you have the temporal lobes. In the kind of central portion of the brain, you have the parietal lobes. And towards the back of the brain, you have the occipital lobe. Now we're moving on to the inferior view of the brain. So this is looking at the brain from below. And one key feature that I want to point out is what I call X marks the spot. You see this X-shaped structure right here is called the optic chiasm. And the front part of it is where the optic nerve comes into the brain. So you can kind of imagine an eyeball here, and then an optic nerve coming into this structure here. The information from the two eyeballs, so from the left and the right, then crisscrosses here, and information from both eyeballs then goes through these optic tracts here. So the optic tracts are after the optic chiasm, which is technically the middle, or where this crisscross is happening. So I use the optic chiasm as kind of a landmark in order to help me find other structures. So first we're going to look at a structure that's anterior to the optic chiasm. And this structure here is known as the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb is responsible for transporting the sensory information associated with smell to the brain. The optic chiasm, just to go back, is associated with the sense of vision or sight. So it helps to carry information from the eyeballs to the brain. So moving posterior from the optic chiasm, the first structure I want to point out is the hypothalamus. So this area right here is known as the hypothalamus. And it is part of the diencephalon. The other parts of the diencephalon we can't see from this view, but on a later picture we're going to take a look at a sagittal cut of the brain, and we'll be able to see the other parts of the diencephalon by looking at it from inside the brain. Another feature I want to point out is that typically, if the pituitary gland were still attached, it would be resting basically right on top of the hypothalamus, or just below it really. So the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are really closely related in structure and function. So they're attached to each other, and they both work together to help control a lot of the other endocrine glands in the body. So when you learn about the endocrine system, you'll learn more about how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland work together. Continuing to move kind of posterior from the optic chiasm, we're going to take a look at a couple of structures associated with the brainstem. So the first structure is this area right here in blue. This area is known as the midbrain. The next structure is this kind of bumpy area here, known as the pons. And then lastly, we have this area back here, known as the medulla oblongata. The next structure I want to point out from this view is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is not actually part of the brain, but it is part of the central nervous system. Also from this view, just to point out a few things that we looked at on the other view, you can see part of the cerebellum kind of peeking out here. And then of course this area up here is the cerebrum. In this view, we're looking at a side view of the sheep brain. So if we were to take a knife and cut right down the longitudinal fissure and separate the brain into left and right halves, this is the view that we would see when we're looking on the inside of the brain. So the first area I want to point out is starting again with the cerebrum. So this whole area here is the cerebrum. And from the side view, we can see the difference between the gray matter and the white matter of the cerebrum. So the gray matter doesn't really look gray. It's a little bit more of a beige type color. But this gray matter is this area in here. It's called the gray matter. And this is called the cerebral cortex. Also in the cerebrum, we have this white matter here. That's known as the corpus callosum. We can also see more of the diencephalon from this view. So the diencephalon is made up of 3 structures. One structure is this area right here. This is known as the epithalamus, and this contains the pineal gland, which produces a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is the hormone that is responsible for your sleep-wake cycle, which is also called the circadian rhythm. So when your pineal gland produces melatonin, it makes you sleepy, and when melatonin production is inhibited, it makes you more awake. The next structure is this circular structure here. This structure is known as the thalamus. And just below the thalamus, we have this area known as the hypothalamus. Now, these 3 structures, which are all in yellow, make up the part of the brain division called the diencephalon. Also from the side view, we can see the structures of the brainstem. The first area is this region right here, known as the midbrain, which we saw while we were looking at the inferior view of the brain as well. Now, in addition to the area that we saw, there are these 2 areas up here. So there's one bump here, and then this kind of bump right here. And these are also part of the midbrain. So the midbrain actually makes up kind of this whole region right here. This top bump here is called the superior colliculus. And the bottom one is known as the inferior colliculus. And plural for these words are colliculi. So more than one colliculus are known as colliculi. The next kind of bump of the brainstem, so this region right here, is the pons. And then the next bump we see is the medulla oblongata. And all the structures in blue make up the brain, or make up the brain division called the brainstem. We can also see the kind of inside view of the cerebellum. So remember, the structure here is the cerebellum. And from this inside view, we can make out the white matter of the cerebellum. And this white matter, as you can kind of see, it looks like it branches like a tree. And so this white matter is called the arbor vitae. And the word arbor should make you think of tree. Additionally, some other structures that I want to point out from this view. We can see the side view of the spinal cord here. We can also see the cut end of the optic chiasm. And then this is a structure that we weren't able to see on the other inferior view of the brain, but we can see it on this image, and this is actually the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland actually work together to control a lot of other aspects of the endocrine system. So when you cover the endocrine system, you'll learn more about the interactions between those two structures and how they affect other endocrine glands. On this slide, we're looking at a frontal or coronal cut that was made through the cerebrum. And I wanted to show you this to give you another look at the difference between the white matter and the gray matter in the cerebrum. So just a reminder, the kind of grayer area or more tan area, this is called the gray matter. And this makes up the cerebral cortex. You can also see from this angle, you can see the gyrus, which is the bump, and the sulcus, which is the divot in between the bumps. This white matter here is part of the corpus callosum.